Hey guys, Paulo here from CongaChops.com, and I hope you're all having an incredible start to your weekend. Now I'm super excited to be here and be a part of this year's all-virtual PASic. So I just want to take a second and shout out the wonderful folks here at the Percussive Arts Society for having me on, and my family at LP Latin Percussion, and Earthworks Audio for providing all of the gear for this masterclass, and for their longtime support and commitment to the arts. Now, in case you're not familiar with CongaChops.com, we're the #1 online education platform for Latin percussionists, and all of the concepts and exercises that I'll share with you in this lesson, you can find in depth and detail over on the site. And if you haven't already, take a second to hit like and subscribe and turn on your notifications for the channel so you'll know when our next lesson drops. So to keep things clear and focused and jam as much as I can into these 30 minutes, I want to split this lesson into 5 different sections to make sure I can address some of the most commonly asked questions from the beginner and intermediate players in the community forum on our site. Now, just as a side note, you'll hear this instrument referred to most commonly as a conga, but you'll also hear it called a tumbadora, jícamo, or timba, regardless of the diameter of the drum or material. So with that said, let's get to it. Here I have 3 LP Giovanni Galaxy Series drums made of wood, an 11 3/4 inch conga here in the middle, and a 12.5 inch tumba on either side. Now, the main reason for this choice is that number 1, for the majority of music where I'm predominantly laying down a groove, I prefer having this 11 3/4 inch conga as my main drum, as I'll rarely use a quinto as my main drum in a 2 or more drum setup. And for those of you gearheads, I'm capturing my sound today with these 3 Earthworks DM20 microphones, which are my personal favorite conga mics for live applications. So as far as the anatomy of the drum, there's not all that much to it. We have the body of the drum, which in this case is made up of wooden staves, but can also be made of a single solid shell in the case of some high-end artisan-made drums. And of course, you can have drums made of fiberglass. Now the main difference being that wood tends to have a bit warmer tone, while all other things equal, fiberglass drums tend to project a bit more. Next we have the hardware, the rim here on top, the lug plates with their respective lugs, and the bottom rim, which helps keep the staves in place. Now, these congas also have a handle, which I like to face towards me, but which some folks might prefer to remove if their drums are always going to be on stands, for example. The main thing to keep in mind here is that each of these lugs, when tightened, applies pressure to the head by pulling the rim down and in effect raising the pitch. The heads I have here are some of LP's stock cowhide heads, which I personally especially dig when they're this nice translucent color, which lets me know that they're on the thinner side and will reverberate really well when tuned properly. But of course you can also opt for a wide variety of rawhides, from steer to mule and everything in between. Or you can opt to go with synthetic heads with some of the amazing options manufactured by Remo. Now, generally speaking, rawhide heads tend to have a warmer, beefier tone than synthetic heads, but they're of course quite susceptible to changes in temperature and humidity. And synthetic heads have the advantage of being very resistant to detuning, and also tend to project a bit more. So if you're doing a lot of gigs outdoors, for example, you might want to opt for synthetic heads, just to avoid running the risk of your drums possibly dropping an octave in tuning between soundcheck and showtime. Now, I personally prefer the feel and the sound of rawhide for most applications, but the convenience of synthetic heads and the fact that they're synonymous with the sound of a lot of more modern salsa recordings is definitely something to consider. Now, as we all know, tuning is one of the most important and fundamental aspects when you're learning to play any instrument. And although there's no concrete right or wrong way to go about tuning the congas, there are definitely certain common tunings that work really well across a wide variety of genres. So, generally speaking, as far as drums that'll be holding down a groove, lower tunings will work better, for example, in folkloric or salsa settings, and just generally in most cases when we're not combating a ton of other sounds in similar frequencies, like we are when we're playing alongside a drum set. In those cases, or in certain styles of music like pop, merengue, sometimes Afrobeat, and a bunch of other applications, we may want to opt for a higher tuning to complement the rest of the drum and percussion section. Now, the best way for you to develop your personal taste as far as tuning is by listening to a wide variety of music from different genres and eras and emulating what you're hearing. For the drums I'm using today, I'm tuned to a C sharp here in the middle, F sharp on my right, and a G sharp here on the left. Now, this is a pretty common 3-drum tuning for a modern salsa context, but it's only one of a bunch of different options. So, in the PDFs that accompany this lesson, you'll see a tuning guide with a bunch of different options for tuning in different musical contexts when using a 2- and 3-drum setup. Now, the main thing we want to keep in mind when tuning the congas is that we want to make sure we're using pitches as a reference, but making sure we're paying attention to the sound of the drum above all else. After all, certain drums tuned to exact pitches at exactly 440 Hz, for example, might not always resonate very well. So, as long as your drums are tuned accurately in between themselves, you'll be good to go. Now, I personally tune my drums every time I sit down to play, tuning my main drum with a keyboard or any app that has a tuning fork function as a reference, and then the rest of my drums I'll tune accordingly by ear, making sure that I'm tightening the lugs evenly as I go around the drum. So now that we have an idea of what the congas are made of and how to tune them, let's talk about how we want to sit at the drums and learn to strike them in a way that's safe for us. Now, as you may or may not have realized, the congas are one of the most physically demanding instruments you'll ever sit down to play. Now, not only are we dealing with mastering different movements and developing the strength required to actually strike the drum, but we're doing so with something that's actually attached to our bodies, our hands. So to make sure we're playing in the healthiest way possible for our bodies, we need to have a couple of things in mind to ensure that we can continue to enjoy this instrument for years to come. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is how you position yourself with the drum. A general guideline is that we want to adjust our seat height so that when our drums are flat, they're right around the height of our belly button. Now, this will of course vary from player to player, depending on their personal preference, the length of their torso, and of course the length of their upper arms. What we're looking for here is to have our drums at a height that allows our arms to be in a very neutral position when resting flat. Now, we don't want to be sitting too high, as it'll put unwanted stress on our shoulders and forearms. And if we're too low, we'll end up hunching over to compensate to strike the drum. So we really want to keep the drums at a nice neutral height. We then want to tilt our main drum forward a bit for two reasons. One, leaving a little gap between the floor and the bottom of the drum will help it project more. And two, we'll place less tension on our wrists by leaning the drum away from us as opposed to keeping it flat while we try to strike it. So we want to make sure that our center drum is tilted forward just enough so that it falls back into our legs and that we're seated toward the edge of our stool or chair so we can hold the drum securely. Next, we want to stick out our chest a bit and have a slight curve in our back just to make sure that we're not hunched over and that we're engaging our back muscles to put us in the best position possible to strike the drum safely. Lastly, we want to make sure that our elbows are neither tucked too tightly into our bodies nor flared out like this when we play. Making sure that we're in the most neutral and comfortable position possible is the first step we'll take on the road to developing great technique. So let's move on to talking about how to strike the drum and some of the different sounds we can get. Now, there's a tendency for folks just starting out to end up whacking the drum with no concern for their personal safety, let alone how the drum even sounds. Now, what we want to do is make sure that we're aware of how we can employ the weight of our hands to do as much of the work as possible and move fluidly as we do so. To do this, the first and smallest muscles we'll employ are wrist muscles. So let's just play a few strokes here in the middle of the drum without worrying too much about the sound just yet, while we keep contact with this part of our wrist and the head, just so we can isolate the wrist motion while we strike the drum. Let's really try to use the weight of our hand to do as much of the work as possible. This movement is at the basis of a lot of the technique related to the conga drum. Now, we'll of course learn to engage our forearms, upper arms, and shoulders as we look to get some more volume and play different tones. But we always need to make sure that we're aware of our wrist movement to maintain fluidity when we play. So, now that we have an idea of how to start striking the drum, let's check out the 5 basic tones that we can produce. The first is the open tone, which we'll achieve by striking the drum near the edge with the meat of our fingers, this part right here. So, let's focus on getting some nice clean strokes while engaging our wrists as we work on getting a warm and round tone. And at these slower tempos, let's really exaggerate our wrist motion to make sure that we're developing strength and flexibility. Next, we have the muffled tone, which we'll achieve by striking the drum in the exact manner as our open tones, but this time we'll press down with our fingers as we stroke. Now, our goal here is to get a nice beefy and present tone even though we're muffling the drum. Now let's move on to the tone that's the most synonymous with the conga, and generally takes the most time to develop, the close slap. Now this time, we want to make contact with this part of our fingers, the inside of our top knuckle, while we slightly cup our hand so that this part doesn't really make contact. Now we'll also leave our hand on the drum after we strike it to get a nice, crisp, and dry sound. And to achieve this sound, we'll need to tense up our wrists a little bit just so we can hit the drum with force. And depending on the size of your hand, you may want to slide your hand slightly inward or outward in relation to the placement of your open and muffled tones. Now again, this one takes quite some time to nail down. so don't get discouraged if it doesn't come as easy to you as the first two tones. The next tone we'll check out is called an open slap, and all we're going to do to achieve this sound is strike the drum in the same way as our close slap, except this time we're going to let our hands come off the drum naturally after we strike it. One of my favorite tones, which we'll check out next, is the bass tone. Now to achieve this sound, we're going to strike the drum here in the center by using the entire surface area of our palms and fingers to get a nice round tone. Now this is the only tone that we'll study that we'll need to fundamentally lift our arms up to execute. So let's check it out. Now just so we can get an idea of the difference in the sound and hand positioning between these tones, as well as the difference in how they feel physically when we strike the drum, let's work on playing them back to back 4 times each while we alternate our hands. And at this slower tempo, let's really try to focus on some of the things I just mentioned, the difference in sound, hand position, and the way each tone feels. Now let's work on playing them a bit closer together over the pulse of a metronome, and really strive for a clear distinction between each sound. As a bonus round, let's work on a great exercise that'll help us strengthen our sense of time and pulse while we work on our sound. So we'll play the same exact sequence of tones, this time using only the 8th note upbeats in cut time at a much faster tempo. And keep in mind that because we're playing these notes closer and closer together, we won't be able to exaggerate our wrist movement as much, and our motions in general will shrink so we can execute the strokes in time.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So there we have the 5 main sounds that we can get out of the drum. And there are of course a wide variety of different textures that you can get from the drum by striking it or rubbing it with different parts of your hand or even fingernails, and of course by playing it with a stick or a mallet. Now, we can also play ghost tones by simply playing any of the sounds we just worked on with less volume. Most commonly, our open tones on the edge or the center of the drum, a soft version of our muffled tone, or a low volume bass tone. Now let's move on to the one technique that really separates the congas from every other single membrane drum out there, the palm tip technique. The advent of this technique starts to take modern conga playing away from gravitating towards playing everything hand to hand like we normally would when playing with traditional djembe technique, for example, and allows us to start to create some grooves where our dominant hand is playing tones and accents out here on the edge of the drum, and our non-dominant hand, in my case my left hand, helps to fill the notes in between towards the center of the drum and from time to time play some accents. We'll achieve this movement by first playing a bass tone with our entire hand, and then lifting from our wrist and striking the drum in a similar way to an open tone but in the center of the drum. Now this movement is something that we'll strive to develop in both hands. So let's work on an exercise that focuses on playing the palm tip motion first with our right hand and then with our left. Really exaggerating these motions when we practice slowly will ultimately help us develop the strength and flexibility we need to play faster and at louder volumes without sacrificing fluidity. And now, another way we can work on our palm tip is by alternating our hands right to left while we play palm, palm, tip, tip. When we speed up this specific sticking and combination of tones, we're left with our palm tip roll. Now, just remember that when we speed things up, the space between our strokes and our motions in general will become smaller. But that doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice volume or fluidity. So let's check out what this exercise sounds like if we really give it some speed. Now that we've got the flashy stuff out of the way, let's move on to a more functional use for the palm tip and get started playing some grooves. Now, the most quintessential rhythm that you'll ever learn on the congas that's rooted deep in the Afro-Cuban tradition is the tumbao. Now, the word tumbao loosely translates to the word groove in English. So you'll hear folks refer to a piano tumbao as well as a bass tumbao, which are just different names for the particular grooves they may play in certain sections of a song. So let's check out the conga tumbao, which can also be called marcha, the Spanish word for march. The modern version of the tumbao, which we'll check out, that involves the palm tip, has its roots in song music from Cuba, which in the 1930s saw the evolution of the traditional song ensemble format with the addition of the conga drum in the legendary Arsenio Rodriguez's conjunto ensemble format. Now, up until then, the congas were primarily used for playing folkloric rhythms of African descent, which were mainly relegated to urban settings. The song, hailing from the Cuban countryside, was traditionally only played with the bongo in terms of percussive drums. So, let's check out a one-bar version of the common tumbao slowly, while we focus on the sound and precision of each stroke, and make sure we're exaggerating our motions to develop flexibility as we practice slowly. You can see that when I went to play my right hand slap tone on beat 2, I kept my left hand resting on the head to help me achieve an even drier and clearer sound. Now, it's important to be aware that there's a tendency for folks just starting out to end up hitting the drum way too hard with their dominant hand when playing tones out here on the edge, and basically letting their non-dominant hand disappear in terms of volume when playing the tumbao pattern. Now, this is in part due to the fact that our resonant tones, like slaps and open tones, are naturally louder than the less resonant tones that we'll play in the center of the drum. So we may want to compensate by playing our tones on the edge of the drum a bit softer, while we develop the strength to play our palm tip louder to achieve a nice balance between both hands. So with that in mind, I'll work on the tumbao at a bit more common tempo for the song, with one of our exclusive Conga Chops practices.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So you can see that our motions shrink quite a bit as we speed up, but we want to keep a clear and powerful sound no matter what tempo we play at. And above all else, we should always strive to play anything and everything that we play with a great feel. After all, this groove and many grooves are made for dancing. So one of the only real ways to actively go about working on developing a great feel is to do our best to study and lock in with the feel of our favorite records when we play along. And of course, by playing live with other more experienced musicians that already have a great feel. So let's check out this groove just a bit faster with some added variations over a more modern sounding practice.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So make sure you take the time to get comfortable with the sticking and the tones of the tumbao before you speed it up. And if you're interested in learning more about some of the variations and fills I just played, make sure to check out our free quick tip lesson series on YouTube. Now, while we're on the subject of grooves that involve our palm tip, let's work on a simple but super versatile groove in 6/8. It's one of the conga patterns used in the bembe rhythm from Cuba. Now, the pattern we'll check out today is one of the bass patterns played on one of the lower pitched drums that accompany in this style. But for now, let's just check it out on our main drum.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Now you can play the same pattern orchestrated on 2 drums as well. So for this next example, I'll play the same groove up to speed, but this time I'll play around with which tone or which drum I choose to play my right hand with. Let's see what it sounds like.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
So this is a super simple concept that you can apply to any groove you already know. By simply reorchestrating or revoicing a rhythm, which basically means choosing what sounds we play each stroke with, we can come up with a bunch of simple variations on the same groove that can add some movement without getting too far away from the original pattern. So with that in mind, let's take the tumbao pattern that we learned and use it as the foundation for building some grooves that can work really well in a pop, funk, or R&B context. So to start off, all I'm going to do is play the tumbao while sticking it hand to hand. Right, left, all the way through. And I'll play the entire groove using ghost tones, only adding an accent on our slap and our 2 open tones.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So this is a great place to start for laying down a groove that can work really well in a pop, funk, or R&B context. But if we want to play something that can potentially work even better and give us a bit less of an Afro-Cuban vibe, we can move our slap tones over to the backbeat to lock up with the drums. Now, of course, this is something that will vary from groove to groove, but for the sake of this example, let's say the drummer is playing his or her snare on beats 2 and 4. Let's check it out.
3, 4.
And we can use this basic structure to start to create song or section-specific grooves for a wide variety of genres. And of course, you can feel free to revoice the pattern and add accents to create variations, and adjust the sticking if you need to accommodate any other melodies that you might want to play. Now, the same concept can be applied to any groove you already know. Take the melody of the rhythm, then stick it hand to hand to start off, and lastly, consider using the backbeats of a particular groove as accents that lock up with what the drums are playing.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So to create this groove, I started off with just a 16th note grid while playing slaps on the backbeats on beats 2 and 4.
2, 3, 4.
Then I added my first draft of the melody, taking inspiration from some of the accents of the bass line and the keyboard part that act as a nice counterpoint to the drum and guitar groove.
2, 3, 4.
Lastly, I added one more open tone on the last 16th note of beat 3 to lock up with the bass and keys. And I got rid of the following slap on beat 4 just to leave some space in the groove.
2, 3, 4.
Now for me personally, I prefer to play palm tip in between the two open tones in the first bar, but you could certainly stick it right, left, all the way through. So now that we have an idea of how we can put together the whole groove, let's hear it one more time up to speed.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So there's a couple of super simple grooves and concepts that you can use to expand on the rhythms and patterns that you already know. Now, as with anything you're working on for the first time, make sure you really take the time to work out the sticking, focus on the sound of each stroke, and keep your movements fluid as you do your best to lock up with the metronome or the feel of the particular track that you're working with. The more you take the time to analyze different players, grooves, and styles, the faster you'll develop your musical vocabulary and start to get an idea for where certain grooves can work great and where they might feel a little out of place. Now, studying in an effort to learn to understand the way that your favorite percussionists think will give you a ton of insight on not only where different grooves can feel natural to play, but also generally improve the way you approach any musical situation, whether it's laying down a groove, playing through an arrangement, or taking a solo. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But if you're interested in studying everything we've covered here in more depth and detail, come check us out at congachops.com. We've got an incredible library of step-by-step courses and lessons on congas and timbales, and as of a couple of weeks from now, bongos as well. We also have over 10 hours of exclusive practice loops, including everything you heard in this lesson, hand-picked Spotify playlists for every pertinent course and lesson on the site, and an amazing community forum where you can meet and discuss with other members as well as get one-on-one feedback on everything you're working on. Also, as a more recent addition to the site and one of my personal favorite features, we've included step-by-step practice routines for each of our main courses. So after you get comfortable with the concepts and exercises in the lessons from each course, we've organized all of the key elements into actionable follow-along video lessons that you can slow down or speed up as you need to. Well, I really hope you enjoyed what we covered in this lesson, and that now you have a much better understanding of how to get started playing congas, and that you've been taking advantage of all of the incredible virtual events these past couple of days here at PASic. I also want to wish you all a wonderful upcoming holiday season. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy, finding some time to spend with your loved ones, and of course, finding some extra time to spend with your instrument. I'll see you in the shed.